The paper plates were still greasy from the barbecue when my father lifted his glass and called me a disgrace in front of 40 people. My name is Meredith Frost, and I was 34 years old, standing at the edge of my own family's Father's Day table. He raised his sweet tea as though he were making a toast. He said he was proud of all his children. Then his eyes landed directly on me, except for the disgrace sitting at this table. Nobody challenged him. Nobody even looked in my direction. So I didn't argue either. I smiled, placed a plain manila envelope beside his plate, wished him a happy Father's Day, and walked toward my car. I had just reached the end of the gravel driveway, my engine running while I waited for a truck to pass, when the screen door slammed open and my father began shouting. Neighbors stepped onto their porches to see what was happening. But to understand what was inside that envelope, you have to go back 5 years, to the day my mother died. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, the channel where quiet people eventually get the final word and the truth always finds its way to the dinner table. If stories about dignity, firm boundaries, and cold justice are your kind of thing, get comfortable, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the moment when everything changes. That morning, before any of this happened, I was sitting inside my office in Cedar Hollow with a client's shoebox full of receipts and a pot of coffee that had already gone cold. Technically, it was a holiday. I kept strange hours whenever a farm family was about to get crushed by a penalty they never saw coming. Earl Dawson had underreported a grain sale. It was an honest mistake, but the notice from the state had 4 zeros attached to it. I found the amended form, located the safe harbor provision, and discovered a way to reduce the amount to almost nothing. Earl cried a little when we spoke on the phone. People sometimes do that when someone finally stands between them and a number that has terrified them. I'm a CPA. I built this office from a card table and a used laptop. One tax season at a time for 12 years. Nobody gave me anything. I'm telling you that not to brag, but so you understand the kind of person my family had decided I was. Cold. Selfish. The daughter who chose spreadsheets over family. I ended the call with Earl and looked at the calendar. Father's Day. I had marked it weeks earlier, then spent those weeks pretending I hadn't. 40 minutes to the family homestead and another 40 minutes back. An entire afternoon of being discussed instead of actually spoken to. Every year I told myself I wouldn't go. And every year I went because the woman who raised me would have wanted me there, and because I still had unfinished business with that house that none of them knew about. I grabbed my keys. I told myself this year was going to be different. I was right, just not in the way I expected. The road to Marrow Creek looked exactly the same as it had throughout my childhood. A two-lane highway, then gravel, followed by the white fence my grandfather painted the summer he returned from Korea. The Frost place had belonged to our family for 3 generations. 80 acres, a barn that leaned slightly toward the south, and the farmhouse where my father had been born in an upstairs bedroom. There was a live oak beside the house that my mother planted the year she got married. She used to tell me, "A family is like that tree. You can't see most of what keeps it standing." I came around the final bend and saw the house covered in flags, cars scattered across the cut hay, and smoke drifting from 2 grills. To anyone passing by, it looked like the happiest home in the county. I parked at the very end of the lane, beyond everyone else. It was the way you park when some part of you is always prepared to leave early. I suppose it had become muscle memory. The body remembers where it isn't wanted long after the mind stops making excuses. I stayed there for a moment with the engine ticking beneath me. Across the yard, I could hear my brother laughing. His laugh was loud and effortless, the laugh of a man who believed the ground beneath his feet belonged to him. I checked my purse. The little tin box was still inside, exactly where I had placed it that morning without allowing myself to question why. I had carried that box for 2 years. Today, for the first time, I had brought it back to the place it originally came from. I didn't know it yet, but by sunset everyone sitting around that table would understand exactly what it meant. Travis greeted the guests at the gate like he owned the entire property. He was 38, 4 years older than me, and he had always possessed a certain way of standing in a doorway that made you feel like you had to ask him to move. He shook hands, slapped backs, and directed people toward the coolers like a man giving visitors a tour of his own estate. His wife, Sandra, handled the other side of the yard, refilling glasses and making comments just loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We're so glad the people who actually show up made it today." She smiled at me when she said it. That was the trick. The smile. Aunt Laura sat beneath the shade like a judge. She was 71 and completely convinced she was right about everything. When she noticed me, her mouth tightened the way it did whenever she spotted a stain on a clean tablecloth. My father stood at the head of the table. He was tall, gray-haired, and still handsome in that weathered way old farmers sometimes are. He gave me such a small nod that it could almost have been a twitch. "Hello to you too, Dad." I carried a deviled egg platter toward the table, because that's what you do when nobody offers you a chair. Then I watched. Watching is really my profession. I noticed where the numbers stopped making sense. And something at that gathering didn't add up. Travis leaned toward my father and whispered something into his ear. My father listened carefully, then slowly nodded. It was the kind of nod you give when you've already made most of the decision. Sandra noticed it too. She glanced at me, then immediately looked away. Whatever my brother was trying to sell that afternoon, my father had already decided to buy it. I just didn't know what it was yet. You don't become the disgrace overnight. It takes one bad season and a room full of frightened people. 5 years earlier, my mother had been dying in the front bedroom, and the farm was sinking fast. I knew that because I was the only person in the family who could read a balance sheet without having to sound out the numbers. The mortgage was 3 payments behind. The equipment loans were even worse, and my brother had a solution. Travis stood at the foot of Mom's bed and presented what he called an investment. A guaranteed opportunity, involving a man he knew who had a feedlot deal that would wipe out the debt by spring. All he needed was for Dad to borrow against the equity in the homestead and put the money in. At first, I only asked questions. Who was this man? Where was the paperwork? And what would happen to the 80 acres if this supposedly guaranteed deal went bad? Travis called me heartless. He pointed out that our mother was lying there dying and accused me of caring more about fine print than family. I had brought a folder with me. I had spent 2 nights putting together a basic projection showing exactly what the deal would cost if it failed, and what losing the house would mean. I held the folder out. My father took it, glanced at it for barely a second, then placed it face down on the dresser without reading a single page. "We don't need your spreadsheets, Meredith. We need faith." And that was the moment the boundary between me and the rest of them became obvious, as clean and straight as a fence post. I had brought numbers to my mother's deathbed. To my family, that was apparently no different from bringing nothing at all. Here's something nobody tells you about being pushed out of a family. You still keep showing up. 2 years ago, on a completely ordinary Tuesday, I drove to my father's place to check on him. Winter had been especially rough, and he had stopped answering his phone. He let me inside with a grunt before returning to his chair. I made coffee in the same kitchen where I had learned how to make it. While the pot was brewing, I noticed something beneath the Sunday newspaper. A pile of mail. The way someone hides something they can't bring themselves to throw away. The top envelope had a bank's name printed in the corner, with red lettering stretched across the front. Second notice. I didn't touch it. I'd like to say I respected his privacy. The truth was I already knew what it meant. After 12 years of reading other people's financial disasters, I could recognize panic the moment I saw it sitting on my own father's kitchen table. I carried his coffee over and carefully said, "Dad, if the farm is having trouble, I can take a look at it. No charge. Just let me see what's going on." He didn't even turn toward me. "The place is fine. I've handled it. Travis and I handled it." The weight always fell where it had before, on the son who stayed and the daughter who kept count. I let it go because pushing him would only get me sent home sooner. But I remained in my car at the end of that driveway for a long time. A man who has everything under control doesn't hide a second notice underneath a newspaper. A man who has solved the problem doesn't have to lie to his own daughter about it. Something was wrong with that farm, and my father would rather watch it disappear than allow me to help. Back at the party, I stood near the edge of the patio with my plate, waiting for a chair that I already knew wasn't coming. There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who share your last name. They're close enough that you could reach out and touch them, yet somehow you still feel like you're standing on the other side of glass. One of my cousin's children looked at me and asked who I was. He wasn't being disrespectful. He was simply being honest the way children are. "I'm your Aunt Meredith," I told him. I watched his face as he decided that information didn't mean very much. Out of habit, I searched the yard for my mother. She would have been near the grills, ordering my father around while secretly stealing the first ear of corn. 5 years had passed since she was gone, but the yard still seemed to have a space shaped exactly like her. I want to make one thing clear, because it matters for everything that happened afterward. I didn't drive out there that day expecting my family to suddenly love me. I had stopped hoping for that a long time ago. I came because I had made my mother a promise, and because there was one final thing I needed to set right. And Father's Day was the day I intended to do it. I touched my purse and felt the hard edge of the little tin box through the leather. Some choices don't really feel like choices. They feel like a season finally changing. Like knowing deep in your bones that winter is ending, even before the last snow disappears. For 2 years, I had carried this family quietly on my back. I let them call me whatever version of me they needed. But that day, silently, that was going to end. I just had to survive the speeches first. The neighbors arrived around 4. The Putes had farmed the neighboring quarter section for almost as long as the Frosts had worked ours. Their fence ran close enough to our patio that you could practically pass a casserole across it. Hal Pute shook my father's hand and complimented the property. My father immediately brightened, the way he only seemed to when someone was watching. He put an arm around Travis and gestured with his other hand toward the farmhouse, the barn, and the old leaning fence. Everything looked golden beneath the late afternoon sun. "This has been Frost land ever since my grandfather cleared it," he said. "And it's going to remain Frostland. 4th generation right here." He gave Travis's shoulder a proud squeeze. "We've got everything figured out." Travis lowered his head, humble as a church deacon. Sandra smiled proudly, and Aunt Laura dabbed at her eyes like she was witnessing a wedding. I stood only 10 feet away, holding a plate of food I hadn't touched. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger. Something colder. Something much quieter. Because I knew exactly what that house was worth. I knew the exact amount owed against it. I knew who held the note. And it wasn't the man standing there giving the toast. He was standing in his own front yard, promising his neighbors a legacy that technically wasn't his anymore, and he had absolutely no idea. Hal Pute lifted his beer. "To the Frosts." Everyone raised their glasses. I raised mine too, because what else was I supposed to do? But my eyes drifted toward the kitchen window, toward the spot where I had once seen that pile of mail hidden beneath the newspaper. I thought, you have no idea how close you came to losing everything. I know what it feels like to stand among people who share your blood and your last name while still feeling like a stranger at your own family table. If you've ever been the person everyone talks about instead of talks to, then you already understand why I stayed silent for so long. Stay with me. What happened next was the part nobody standing in that yard could have predicted. The feedlot deal collapsed. Of course it did. Deals like that usually fall apart when there's no real paperwork holding them together. The man Travis trusted took the money and disappeared before the ground even had time to thaw. My mother died that April, before the corn went into the fields, and the family needed someone to blame for what happened. They weren't going to blame grief, and they couldn't blame a con man nobody could locate. So they blamed me. At the funeral, my Aunt Lorna told 3 different women that Meredith cared more about money than she cared about her own mother. Travis stood beside the casket with one hand over his heart, playing the beautiful son, the one who supposedly tried to save the farm while his sister sat at home with a calculator. He cried perfectly. He always knew how to cry when people were watching. And I let them tell the whole story. Because correcting them beside my mother's grave would have made me look exactly like the cold person they claimed I was. But there was something none of them ever discovered. During my mother's final 6 weeks, she stayed in a hospice bed at home. A nurse came 3 days a week, and she needed medication that insurance companies always seemed determined to make difficult to get. Someone had to pay those bills. It wasn't my father. He had nothing left except his pride and his courage. It wasn't Travis. He was too busy chasing money that he had already lost. I paid for it. Quietly. Every invoice. I used a billing address that wasn't connected to me, so nobody would ask questions. I held my mother's hand the night she died. And she knew, even if nobody else ever did, which of her children had been keeping count and which one had actually shown up. Except the disgrace, my father would say years later, raising his glass. He never realized he was toasting the woman who had made sure his wife could die with dignity. Meanwhile, Travis worked the party like a man campaigning for office. I watched him guide Halpute and two of our cousins on a slow walk around the property, pointing toward the barn, the newer stretch of fencing, and the back 40 where the soybeans were growing green. He spoke about everything with the effortless confidence of someone who believed he owned it. When Dad finally steps away, he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "We've got plans. We're going to bring the whole operation into the modern age." Sandra walked beside him, her arm linked through his, nodding along with every sentence. There's a certain rhythm to a man laying the groundwork for something. I've sat across from enough people at my desk to recognize it immediately. You don't speak that confidently about what happens after Dad retires unless you've already started moving pieces into place. I drifted close enough to refill my tea and caught the end of Travis's conversation. He was telling one of our cousins that the transfer was almost complete. Just a few signatures left. Getting everything squared away so there won't be any mess later. No mess later. That phrase stuck with me. People who genuinely plan to inherit a farm don't usually talk about avoiding a mess. They talk about harvests, weather, crop prices, and diesel costs. But the word that kept circling in my head was almost. Almost done. A few signatures. My brother was rushing toward something. And a man who is desperate to get papers signed is usually a man who's afraid of what might happen if he waits. For the first time that afternoon, I put my glass down. I stopped thinking about how uncomfortable it was to be there. I started paying attention. I should probably explain how someone ends up qualified to quietly dismantle the financial disaster of her own family. When my mother first became sick, I had only been 3 years into my practice. I was barely getting by, doing tax work for hog farmers and the woman who owned the local diner. But farm clients teach you things that city accountants rarely get to see. You learn how a place can be worth $1 million on paper and still collapse because there isn't enough cash in March. You learn what a charge-off means when a bank stops trying to collect and sells the debt for pennies. You learn what a lien is and what a note means and how a deed actually passes from one person to another in this country. I learned all of it because my clients lived and died by those rules, and because somewhere deep in my mind, I already knew my own family was standing on that same cliff. By the time the second notice appeared beneath my father's newspaper, I wasn't a scared daughter anymore. I was a professional who knew exactly what that red ink meant and exactly how little time remained before a bank could turn a family farm into an item on an auction list. That knowledge is a heavy burden to carry into a home where nobody will allow you to help. At night, I'd sit at my desk and calculate the numbers for a place where I wasn't welcome, simply so I'd know how serious things were. Bad. It was very bad. But the same. Training that allowed me to recognize the cliff also showed me the ledge, that narrow, legal, almost invisible ledge, where someone with enough patience and savings could stand and catch a falling home. I only had to be willing to do it by myself. The week after I discovered that second notice, I went to see Walt Harrove. Walt had practiced real estate law in Marrow Creek since before I was born. He was a heavy-set man who wore reading glasses he never cleaned and had a memory like a steel trap. He had known my grandfather. He had prepared the deed when my parents got married. If anyone could explain what was truly happening to the farm, it was Walt. I sat across from him at his cluttered desk and asked him directly. He removed his dirty glasses and rubbed his eyes for a long moment. Then he told me the mortgage was beyond saving. The bank had already charged off the loan and packaged it for sale, the way they do when they've decided a property is a loss. The homestead was only weeks away from being put up for auction, and my father hadn't told anyone. Not Travis, not Lorna, not a single person. He would rather lose 3 generations of Frost land quietly than admit out loud that he couldn't keep it. I sat there for a moment. The clock on Walt's wall kept ticking. Then I asked him the question that changed everything. "Walt," I said, "if the bank has already given up on the note, can a third party purchase it? Can someone simply step in and buy the debt?" He froze. He placed his glasses back on and stared at me over the top of them. Really stared, the way someone looks when they're suddenly reconsidering everything they thought they knew about you. He said, "Yes, someone can. It's legal. It's quiet.
And if it's
handled properly, the bank doesn't care who writes the check."
He paused.
"Meredith, are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" I didn't respond immediately. I was already calculating the numbers. "I need you to understand what this cost, because none of it was some gift that magically appeared out of nowhere. I'd spent 12 years building my practice into something that was finally worth a little money. I had a retirement account I'd been contributing to since I was 22. I owned a small office building, and I'd paid it down until only a fraction of what I originally owed remained. To purchase that note, I borrowed against the office, emptied most of my retirement, and drained the savings I'd kept for the rainy day every farm kid grows up being taught to fear. I sat in Walt's office and signed away my own financial security to catch a house that was falling, knowing the people living inside it would never even realize someone had caught it. We handled everything properly. Walt created a trust to hold the note and the recorded lien against the property, using terms I specified.
On
paper, the trust simply became the lender, the new name attached to the old bank loan, and I placed the entire thing into forbearance. No payments required. No collection attempts. The debt was simply frozen in place. My father continued living in that house exactly as he always had. No rent. No notice. No one knocking on his door.
The
bank received its money and walked away. And the auction that had been only weeks away from destroying my family simply never happened. As far as everyone else knew, Raymond Frost had taken care of it. He even started believing that himself. And I allowed him to. I allowed it because the other option was walking into that house and saying, "I saved you," and watching his face twist with humiliation. Because being rescued by the disgrace would have been more painful to him than losing the land itself. So I told nobody. That night, I drove back to Cedar Hollow much poorer and carrying a secret that felt heavier than the debt itself. I had done it for a reason I hadn't yet said aloud. The reason was inside a tin box. Back in the present, the noise from the party rose and fell like changing weather. Someone started the ice cream churn. Children shrieked beneath the sprinkler. My father held court at the head of the table. Travis kept everyone's cups filled, and the entire afternoon continued without me, just like it always had. I quietly slipped
away.
I crossed the yard toward my mother's live oak, where the voices became quieter and the shade grew deeper, and sat on the old iron bench. My father always promised he would repaint every spring, but never did. From there, I could see the entire party from a distance, like a scene happening to somebody else. I pulled the tin box from my purse and rested it in my lap. It was an old fruitcake tin, dented along the side, with faded poinsettias painted across the lid. My mother used to keep buttons inside it. Later, when she became sick, she kept other things there. After she died, my father couldn't bring himself to go through her dresser. So that responsibility fell to me, just like the difficult, quiet responsibilities always had. I found the box at the back of her bottom drawer beneath a folded quilt. Inside was a letter with my name written across the front in her handwriting, the cursive shaky around the edges. I had read it once on the night I discovered it, then put it away and carried it with me for 2 years without opening it again, because some letters can only be survived so many times. But I'd brought it back to the farm deliberately that day. I needed to read it beneath the shade of her tree before I did what I'd come there to do. So I lifted the lid. The paper had softened from years of being folded and unfolded. As I read it, my mother's voice almost seemed to come alive beside me on that bench. "Meredith," she had written, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone, so I'm going to say everything plainly, just the way you prefer it. I know about the farm. I've known for longer than your father realizes. I watched him hide those notices, and I watched him depend on Travis. And I know where this road leads if someone doesn't step in. She explained how she had married into the land at 19 and slowly learned to love it, the same way you sometimes learn to love a difficult person by accepting everything they demand from you. Then came the part one had carried inside me for 2 years. Your father is going to lose this place. His pride will never allow him to accept help from the one child capable of saving it. That child is you, Meredith. It has always been you. You're the one who can carry something through the darkness without needing anyone to praise you for it. So, I'm asking you to do something difficult. Save the farm if you can. Do it quietly. Let your father keep his pride, even when he hasn't earned it, because this land isn't only for him. It belongs to the people who come after us. Someone has to be the unseen root holding everything together. Then she wrote the words that stayed with me most. He may never thank you.
Do it anyway.
You have always been the strong one, Mare. That's why it has to be you. I sat beneath her tree and read the letter twice. The second time I didn't cry. Mom would have found that funny because she always said I cried over the wrong things and stayed dry-eyed when I should have broken down. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the tin. He may never thank you. Do it anyway. For 2 years, that was exactly what I had done. And across the yard, the man I had sacrificed for was preparing to stand up and call me a disgrace. I put the tin back into my purse and remained on the bench for a few more minutes. I watched my father move among the guests, trying to feel the warmth Mom must have wanted me to feel. But I couldn't. What settled over me was something colder. There is a special kind of bitterness that comes from keeping someone comfortable on a foundation they don't even realize you built. My father laughed at a joke, refilled his tea, and looked completely content. He had no idea he was enjoying the happiest day in a house his own daughter had secretly kept over his head for 2 years. The lien was in my name. He had never known. I nearly laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was letting the bitterness become something uglier. Mom had asked me to be the unseen root, and I had done exactly that. I probably would have continued doing it for the rest of his life. That had been the plan. I would protect the house, keep it safe in silence, and eventually pass it forward without ever asking for recognition. I had accepted being called the disgrace, if that was the price of keeping the Frost land intact. But peace only works when everyone plays their part. I could remain invisible. I could carry the burden forever for my mother. What I could not accept was watching someone take the very property I had sacrificed everything to protect and sell it right out from under us. And without realizing it yet, sitting beneath that tree, I was about to discover that my brother was doing exactly that. I headed back toward the party to get some pie, and that was when I noticed Travis pulling my father away from everyone. They stopped near the side of the house beside the propane tank, the kind of place people choose when they want a conversation no one else can hear. I paused at the corner, paper plate in my hand, looking like an ordinary woman getting dessert. Invisible just as I had been all afternoon. Travis had a folder. He opened it against the wall and handed Dad a pen. "Right here, Dad," he said. "And here where the tabs are. Once you sign these, everything is squared away and nobody can cause trouble later." My father reached into his shirt pocket for his reading glasses, but they weren't there. He squinted down at the papers. "That's a lot of paperwork, son." Travis smiled calmly. "It's nothing. Just lawyer stuff. It protects the property. You trust me, don't you?" There it was again, the question Travis had been asking our father his entire life. Except it wasn't really a question. My father took the pen. But before he could sign, a gust of wind lifted the folder's cover. I caught sight of the logo on the top page. It wasn't a bank. It wasn't Walt's law firm. It was a company I recognized from my professional work, a real estate firm 2 counties away that specialized in exactly one thing. They didn't protect properties. They moved them. My father lowered the pen toward the page, and before I could think, I called across the yard.
"Dad, wait."
He looked toward me, clearly irritated by the interruption. Travis immediately snapped the folder shut, as quickly as someone closing a door on a room they didn't want discovered. "It's family business, Meredith," Travis said. "Nothing that concerns you." The same old line. The one that had kept me outside every important family decision since I was 19. My father's expression hardened. Well, finish it inside, son. He tucked the folder under his arm and led Travis back toward the crowd. Just like that, the moment disappeared. I remained there, my pie getting warm and completely forgotten in my hand. But moments like that stay with you. A few minutes later, I was standing near the drinks table when I noticed Sandra beside Aunt Lorna. The two women had their heads together, whispering more loudly than they realized. She was practically glowing. She had no idea I was close enough to hear her. Once everything is signed over, she said, Travis says we'll finally get what we're owed after all we've put up with. Aunt Lorna squeezed her hand. It's about time someone around here made a sensible decision. Signed over. Not inherited. Not someday. Signed over now. There was a real estate company's logo on those papers, and my brother was clearly in a hurry. All afternoon, I had been gathering little pieces of information. Standing there beside the drinks table, they finally fit together into one unmistakable picture. Travis wasn't protecting the farm for another generation. He was convincing our father to put the entire homestead under his control so he could sell it and collect what he believed the family owed him. I put my pie down. I needed to see those documents. And I needed to see them before my father put his signature on anything. I waited for an opening. It came when the cake was served and everyone gathered around the long table, including Travis and my father. I told one of my cousins I needed to use the bathroom, then slipped through the kitchen door into the cool, quiet house where I had grown up. The folder was sitting on the kitchen table beside my father's glasses and a set of car keys. I'm not proud of what I did next. But I'm not sorry either. I opened it. The first page showed exactly what I had feared, and somehow, it was even worse. It was a completed listing agreement naming the homestead, all 80 acres, the barn, everything. Near the top was the proposed selling price. It was shockingly low. The kind of price someone chooses when they want a property gone quickly and don't care about its real value. But that wasn't what made me stop breathing. At the bottom, where the seller's signature should have been, it didn't say Raymond Frost.
It said,
Travis Frost, by power of attorney. Standing in my mother's kitchen, I finally understood the entire scheme. Months earlier, Travis had apparently convinced Dad to sign a limited power of attorney, disguising it as ordinary legal paperwork that would supposedly protect the property. Now he was using that authority to prepare the farm for sale. The signatures my father was being asked to provide today weren't there to protect anything. They were the final pieces Travis needed to complete the sale. Dad thought he was protecting his family's legacy. He was actually giving his son the ability to sell the home and shut him out of stopping it. I pulled out my phone and photographed every page, the listing agreement, the ridiculously low asking price, and Travis's signature as the seller. Then I closed the folder exactly the way I had found it. My hands never shook. They rarely do. That's something nobody in my family ever gave me credit for. When people underestimate you for years, they eventually stop being careful around you. They assume you aren't paying attention. They assume you aren't important enough to notice what's happening. By the time my brother placed those papers in front of our father, I had already spent 2 years learning exactly what our family owned and exactly who was trying to take it. Keep watching. The envelope was much closer than anyone realized. I didn't confront anyone at the party. That was exactly what they expected from the disgrace. An emotional scene, tears, accusations, and nobody taking her seriously.
I wasn't going to give them that.
I returned outside, ate a small piece of cake, said polite goodbyes, and waited until I could slip around the barn where I had enough phone signal. Then I called Walt Harrove at home, even though it was Sunday. He answered while apparently eating cake himself, with a party going on in the background. I told him everything I had discovered, the folder, the real estate company, and the listing agreement Travis had signed using the power of attorney. Walt immediately stopped chewing. He asked me 3 precise questions. When was the agreement dated? What was the brokerage's name? And was the selling price written on the document? I gave him every answer. There was silence on the other end. Then Walt said something I already suspected, but needed to hear from someone who understood the law. Meredith, if that power of attorney is valid, and he lists the property and finds a buyer, your father could lose the farm within 60 days. And once the process is underway, there may not be much Raymond can do. Then Walt added something even more disturbing, especially if Raymond doesn't even understand what he signed. I leaned against the old barn my grandfather had built and stared across the green back 40, the crooked fence, and my mother's live oak. 60 days. My brother had created a quiet, carefully planned machine designed to take the family homestead. And it was already moving. He had thought of almost everything. Almost. Because there was one thing Travis didn't know. The farm could never be sold without going through me first. This is where the entire afternoon changed. My brother had spent months manipulating my father, collecting signatures, arranging a buyer, and turning that power of attorney into a weapon that could transfer the family farm and put the money in his pocket. What he called what we're owed. And honestly, it was a clever plan. Patient. Calculated. Cool. Exactly the kind of strategy Travis had always been better at than earning things honestly. But every plan depends on an assumption. And his entire plan depended on one assumption that had been false for 2 years. He believed the farm could be sold free and clear. It couldn't. When I purchased that charged-off mortgage note and placed it into the trust, the bank's claim against the property became mine. The recorded deed of trust, the lien securing the debt, now belonged to the trust one had funded and controlled. My father still held the title. On paper, the land was still his. But the property carried a lien covering its full value. And the person holding that lien was me. My father had continued living there exactly as he always had. Nothing about his daily life changed because of what I had done, so he never suspected a thing. Now imagine the scene. My brother was standing in the side yard, convincing our father to sign authority, allowing him to sell the family home. But that home was already legally protected from being sold out from under us. Travis simply didn't know it. A power of attorney allows you to act on someone else's behalf, but a power of attorney gave him authority to act on someone's behalf, but it didn't give him the ability to hand a buyer a clean title while a lien covering the property's full value was held by someone else. Travis had carefully built a key and placed it into a lock that opened absolutely nothing. He could advertise the farm. He could meet with buyers and shake their hands. But the moment anyone performed a title search, the entire scheme would fall apart. The claim against the property no longer belonged to the bank, and it wasn't something Raymond could simply erase. It belonged to a trust. And the trustee was me, the family disgrace. So I had a decision to make. Standing behind the barn with my phone still warm in my hand, I could stay completely silent. I could let Travis push his scheme forward until it ran straight into the title search and collapsed by itself. The buyer would walk away. Travis would have to explain to the real estate company why he had attempted to sell property he couldn't legally deliver. My father might never even discover how close he had come to losing everything. And I could continue being the invisible root my mother had asked me to become, quietly protecting the land for another generation while letting everyone call me whatever they needed to keep their version of the family intact. That was the safe option. It was the same road I'd walked for 2 years, and I knew exactly how to walk it. But I sat on an overturned bucket in the shade of the barn and thought about Mom's letter. He'll never thank you.
Do it anyway.
She had asked me to protect the land. She had never asked me to protect the lie. There was a difference. It had taken me 2 years and one Father's Day to finally understand it. Saving the property in silence had cost me money and pride. But protecting the lie year after year had cost me my place in my own family. It allowed Travis to continue looking like the loyal son while secretly trying to take everything from all of us. And it allowed my father to believe that the daughter who had saved him was actually the child who had failed him. Mom had asked me to preserve his pride, even when he didn't deserve it. But a man who was preparing to sell the very legacy he proudly bragged about didn't deserve to have the truth hidden from the people listening to him boast about it. So I made my choice. Not revenge. Daylight. I walked back around the barn, planning to give my father one final chance. The same way I'd tried to warn him about the second notice 2 years earlier. I owed him that much. I found him near the dessert table, away from Travis for once. I lowered my voice. Dad, before you sign anything else today, Will you let me read it?
Just let me look at it.
5 minutes, please. For one brief second, something changed in his expression, and I allowed myself to hope. Then Travis appeared beside him, as if he'd been waiting for the moment. My father's jaw tightened. Whatever small opening had appeared immediately slammed shut. He looked at me in front of Hal, the cousins, his sister, and everyone nearby. Then he said it loudly enough for all of them to hear. You lost the right to worry about this family the day you let your mother die. The words hit me like a physical blow. Hal immediately looked down at his shoes. Sandra hid a smile behind her cup, and I stood there beneath the fading golden sunlight, carrying 5 years of being called the disgrace on my shoulders. In that moment, I understood. There was no quiet way left. I had offered him the truth gently. He had thrown it back at me in front of witnesses. He wanted me excluded. He wanted it public.
Fine.
I'd spent my entire life being told I was cold. So I allowed myself to become exactly as cold as the moment required. Not cruel. Not emotional. Just completely, professionally clear. If he wanted the truth brought into the open, then he was going to get the truth in the open. And I wouldn't need to raise my voice once. I left the party before the speeches began. Nobody even noticed me walking away, which somehow felt fitting. I drove the 40 minutes back to Cedar Hollow with the windows down and my mother's letter lying on the passenger seat. By the time I reached my office, the sun was sinking and my thoughts were completely settled. I unlocked the door, walked inside, and switched on a single lamp. Then I printed 3 documents. The first was the recorded deed, the public record showing the homestead held by my trust, dated 2 years earlier and stamped by the county. The second was the bank's payoff letter, proving that the debt that had nearly destroyed the farm had been completely paid off by me during the same spring my father had been telling the neighbors that he had handled everything himself. The third was the listing agreement, the one I'd photographed in my mother's kitchen. Travis's signature was at the bottom, made under power of attorney. The asking price was so low it was almost insulting. 3 pieces of paper. The complete truth of 5 years. All of it sitting there in black and white. The one language my family had never allowed me to speak. I didn't add an accusation. I didn't write a letter calling my father cruel. I didn't call my brother a thief. The documents said everything for me. They didn't need to shout. That was never how I worked. I aligned the pages carefully and placed them inside a plain manila envelope, the same kind I used for my clients. Then I wrote one simple sentence across the front in my steady accountant's handwriting. Happy Father's Day. I switched off the lamp and went home, because Father's Day wasn't finished yet, and that envelope still had one final destination. I almost didn't return. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the envelope in front of me and thought about what would happen once those papers were opened. There would be no taking them back. My father would discover, in front of everyone, that the daughter he called a disgrace had secretly controlled the fate of his home for 2 years. Travis would be exposed. The version of our family that everyone had repeated for years would shatter right there on the patio, and there would be no putting it back together the way it had been.
Part of me still wanted to protect them from that.
That was the part of me Mom had always understood, the part that grew quietly in the dark and never demanded recognition. But I read her letter one more time, and I let her final words settle inside me. He'll never thank you.
Do it anyway.
She had written those words about saving the land. But now I understood that do it anyway meant the whole truth. Not just the convenient, quiet part. It meant allowing the truth to sit down at the family table, even if telling it cost me the last little piece of belonging I had left. I wasn't going back to humiliate my father. God knew he had already handled that part himself. Without my help. I was going back because a lie had carried my name for 5 years, and I was finally done letting it. I checked the time. The party was beginning to wind down, with family gathered around and neighbors lingering by the fence. The perfect audience for the only kind of revenge I believed in. The kind where you stop allowing people to lie about you and let the paperwork speak for itself. I grabbed the envelope and my keys. By the time I returned up the gravel drive, dusk was approaching. Most of the cars were gone, but the main group remained. Families sat around the long table while the Putes leaned against the fence with coffee and citronella candles flickered against the bugs. The summer light had turned that deep golden color that makes everything look like a memory while you're still living it. I parked at the far end of the lane, as I always did, and walked through the cut hay with the envelope in my hand. The conversations quieted as I approached, the way they always do when the person everyone has been discussing finally appears. Travis noticed me first, and something tightened in his expression. For a moment, I saw the boy who used to check whether I'd caught him taking the last of something. He didn't know what I knew. But men like my brother always sense the storm before they understand where it's coming from. At the head of the table, my father held court with a glass in his hand, telling the Putes a story about my grandfather. Travis recovered quickly, lifted his own glass, and called out with a warm but fake smile. "Hey, before everybody heads out, somebody ought to say something for Dad. Father's Day, and all." Everyone murmured in agreement and raised their cups. My father waved them off in the way men do when they secretly want to be encouraged. Then he slowly stood, tall and gray beneath the candlelight. The patriarch, the happiest man at a party in a house he didn't own. I stopped a few feet from the table, keeping the envelope at my side where no one would notice it yet. I waited for my father to say what I already knew he was going to say. My father raised his glass and looked around the table at everything: the family, the land, the golden evening, his entire kingdom. "I've been blessed," he said, his voice carrying across the yard the way it always did when he had an audience. "3 generations on this ground." He began naming his blessings, moving around the table. He nodded toward Travis first. "My son who stayed, who works this land beside me." Sandre received a nod. Then the cousins. Even Aunt Lorna pressed a hand to her chest. He said he was proud of all his children. Then his eyes landed on me standing just beyond the end of the table in the candlelight, and the warmth vanished from his face like water draining from a cracked trough. Everyone at the table followed his gaze. "Proud of all my children," he repeated, slower this time, making sure the neighbors heard too. "Except the disgrace sitting at this table." The words spread across the patio and hung beneath the bug lights. A fork stopped scraping. Hal Pute looked away. Sandre raised her cup to hide her smile, but didn't quite succeed. Aunt Lorna gave a small, satisfied nod, like a judge confirming her own verdict. And Travis, my brother, the thief in a clean shirt, looked at me with something close to pity because he thought he'd already won. This was simply the moment when they would put the disgrace back in her place before the night ended. Nobody defended me.
Not one of them.
In 5 years, not one ever had. I stood perfectly still and let the silence finish. Then I did the only thing left that belonged to me. There were no tears. I want you to understand that because everyone at that table was waiting for them. They wanted the disgrace to break down, make a scene, and prove their story right. I've never given people the version of me they wanted. So I smiled. A real smile, almost gentle, which I think unsettled my father more than shouting ever could. I stepped toward the head of the table, into the candlelight, close enough that he had to look directly at me. Then I placed the manila envelope beside his plate, perfectly square and quiet, the way you place something that's already been decided. His eyes dropped to the words on the front. "Happy Father's Day." Then his eyes returned to mine, narrowed and suspicious. A man who could feel the ground shifting beneath him, but didn't yet know which direction it would move. "What's this?" he asked. It wasn't really a question. It was a warning. I kept my voice calm and even, the same voice I use when a client is about to hear something difficult but true. "Happy Father's Day, Dad," I said. "Open it when you're ready." That was all. No accusation. No speech. 5 years of truth, waiting inside that envelope. I said fewer words to him than he'd just spent insulting me. I looked around the table once, at Travis, Sandre, Lorna, the Putes frozen by the fence, and let them all see how completely calm I was. Then I turned and walked back through the cut hay toward my car. Behind me, I heard my father pick up the envelope. I heard the paper move. I didn't turn around. Some things don't need to be watched to know they've landed. The walk to my car felt a mile long. Behind me, the patio had gone silent in that strange way crowds do when they don't know whether they should feel embarrassed or afraid. I heard Travis speaking loudly for the neighbors. "She's just being dramatic."
You know how she gets. Ignore it, Dad.
Throw it out. But my father didn't throw it away. I knew that without looking. There is a certain silence a man makes when he's reading something that doesn't fit the story he's always believed. Open it, someone murmured. Maybe Sandra. Maybe Lorna. I reached my car and rested my hand on the door handle, stopping for one final moment in the fading light. I thought about my mother beneath her oak tree, the night she died, and all those years of invoices nobody ever knew about. This is for you. I wasn't sure whether I meant my mother or the younger version of myself, the girl who had once carried a folder into a deathbed and been told the family needed faith instead. Behind me came the unmistakable sound of the envelope being torn open. Then papers rustled beneath the candlelight. My father inhaled sharply, and across that golden evening, I heard his breath catch as his eyes reached the first line. I opened my car door. The screaming was about to begin. My father read the first page, then the second, then the third. Everyone watched as the color slowly drained from his face. The first page was the deed of trust recorded with the county 2 years earlier. The lien on the homestead and all 80 acres had been assigned to my trust, with my name listed as trustee. The second page was the bank's payoff letter, proving the debt that nearly destroyed the farm had been paid in full.
By me.
The same spring he'd told these neighbors he'd handled it himself. The third page was the listing agreement, with his son's signature at the bottom under power of attorney and the low asking price printed across the top. The entire scheme to sell the family home had been exposed, and the man making the Father's Day toast finally understood everything. The disgrace had saved the farm. The son he'd just praised had been trying to sell it. The legacy he'd promised everyone wasn't actually safe for 2 years. And the only thing standing between the farm and the auctioneer had been me. My father shot out of his chair so quickly that it toppled backward into the grass. Travis. His voice cracked. What is this? What did you do? Travis stood immediately, his hands raised, all his easy charm gone. Dad, that's not. She's twisting it. But my father wasn't listening anymore. He was flipping through the pages with shaking hands, shouting now without even forming clear words. It was the sound of a proud man watching every story he'd built about himself collapse at once. The Putes stepped away from the fence. Down the road, porch lights came on as neighbors came outside to see what had shattered the quiet evening. I was already in my car, window down, when my father finally screamed my name across the yard. Not the disgrace. My name, Meredith. I started the engine and said the only thing I had left to say. Quietly, through the open window and into the chaos of the people who had never defended me. I didn't come to take anything, Dad. I came to give it back. It was always going to be yours. I just made sure no one could take it from you, including him. I didn't stay to watch everything burn. That's the difference between me and the people at that table. They needed an audience for everything, their pride, their grief, their cruelty. I didn't need one for my justice. I drove home in the dark, but I saw enough in the rearview mirror to last me. Travis was backing away from the table with his hands raised, talking rapidly, and nobody looked at him the way they once had. Sandra had stepped away from her husband, leaving a clear space between them, the first crack in a marriage built around what they believed they were owed. Aunt Lorna sat there with her mouth open, and for once in her 71 years, she had nothing to say. And my father, my proud, stubborn, foolish father, had finally sat back down in the chair someone had placed for him. The papers rested loosely in his lap as he stared at the deed bearing my name, finally realizing the truth he had never bothered to see. The neighbors stood by their fences, watching everything unfold. Everyone who had heard him call me a disgrace was now witnessing the other side of the story. I drove home in silence with my mother's letter beside me. After 5 years, my hands finally began to shake. I let them. I had earned that right. The farm listing disappeared within a week. Travis's plans collapsed, and the debts he had hoped to pay remained. Sandra took the children to her mother's, and the town quickly learned who Travis really was. Walt, and I finished what I had started 2 years earlier. This time, my father knowingly placed the farm into a family trust. He could live there for the rest of his life, but Travis could never sell it again. I remained the trustee. 9 days after Father's Day, my father called. He didn't really apologize, but for the first time in 5 years, he called me Meredith instead of a disgrace. He asked why I had never told him I was the one who saved the farm. "You wouldn't have accepted my help if you knew it was me," I said. He stayed quiet because he knew I was right. Then he asked if I would visit the farm again. I told him I would always protect the roof over his head, for my mother, the land, and the generations to come. But I would never again stand somewhere I was treated like a disgrace. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't argue. I finally understood that being strong doesn't mean staying silent forever. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let the truth speak for itself. If you've ever been called a disgrace by people who never saw what you carried in silence, share your story in the comments. Subscribe to Diana True Stories, where the quiet ones always get the last word.